So, Dr. Amishi Jha is a neuroscientist and associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Miami in Florida, and the director of contemplative neuroscience for the UMass Mindfulness Initiative. So what she studies, I think, will be very interesting to you, is the influence of mindfulness training on the brain's attention system. And this was the first study to actually demonstrate this, right? So it took Western culture, something that the Indians and Chinese had known for 5,000 years. And Amishi did the first study in 2007. Yeah. So the effect of mindfulness training on the brain's attention systems as it regards to thinking, feeling, and resilience in the context of high-stress professions. So I will turn it over to you, ma'am. All right.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me? Okay, great. So I have a radical suggestion. We've been talking together about mindfulness practice since the beginning of the conference yesterday morning. What do you guys say we take a minute and actually do a practice? What do you think? As somebody who's a neuroscientist who does not teach mindfulness, I figured I should be the person to do it. So let's do it. It's going to be very painless. If you've never done it before, you will survive. All I ask you to do for the next moment or two is to, if you're feeling comfortable, to get in an upright, alert posture. Keep both feet on the ground. And you're welcome to just lower your gaze or close your eyes if you're comfortable. And for the next minute or so, we're going to do a mindfulness of breathing exercise. So what I'd ask you to do is for a moment, just connect with your breath. With the sensations of your breath moving in and out of your body, whether it's the coolness of air coming in and out of your nostrils, or your abdomen moving in and out, whatever it is that seems most prominent. And pay attention to that. And just maintain your attention on that sensation. If you notice your mind wanders away to other thoughts, feelings, just gently return it back. And in the next moment or two, you can feel free to open your eyes again and return your attention back to this up front to me. And we'll get started with my presentation. Anybody not survive? Okay, great. Well, this is a real pleasure, and I've really enjoyed having a chance to talk to many of you today. I'm very fortunate to be able to share with you a lot of the work that we've been doing, and actually, it's a great opportunity for me to share with you the brain science behind a lot of what's been happening in this area. But I wanted to make something completely clear up front, because I am a card-carrying scientist. My mission is not to provide you with evidence that will arm you to be able to go back to your bosses and leaders and say, this stuff works, just implement. My mission is actually to make you extremely responsible consumers of information, and to make it so that anything you hear in the popular media, you observe with a scrutiny in the spirit of mindfulness, and that we don't impose our view of what we think even the practice of mindfulness itself might be doing to our body, to our mind, and to our relationships. Okay, so that's sort of my full disclosure up front, is that it's going to be a complicated road, and I'll try to make it as sort of straightforward as possible. But my interest really is in elevating our understanding, our collective understanding of what these ancient practices brought to modern times are doing. Okay? And as Jeremy said, I have the coveted post-lunch spot, so try to stay awake. I want to begin actually with a question. It's a really hard one. Does physical exercise improve physical health? If you think it does, please raise your hand. Okay, so that's every single hand in the room, right? And we're at the point now where it seems like a silly question to ask. It's an obvious cultural understanding that if we exercise in a regular fashion, our bodies are going to benefit. And what I want to convey is that that understanding didn't happen on its own. That understanding happened because research, because decades of science actually allowed us to come to some fuller grasp on what it is that we should be doing to stay more physically fit. And it's the science that allows our public health officials to now provide us with evidence-based guidance on what we should do to keep ourselves healthy, right? And so what was that science? What is it that has been done through those efforts? And that's sort of shown up here. The science is asking questions about how. Not just if physical activity is important, but how is it that it actually promotes physical health? So we want to look at things like functioning when people are actually engaged in the physical activity while they're running. Or if you're an athlete, what happens to you if you're not moving at all? What's your baseline cardiovascular functioning, right? As well as structural changes. What happens when somebody decides to do sprints every day? Does their body physically get altered in some knowable way? And then finally, what does it do to our performance? How does it change our effectiveness in what we're trying to achieve by engaging in physical fitness? So all of these are just windows in to our understanding of this relationship. And if we look at a time period, a relatively recent time period from 1980 to present day, there have been over 300,000 articles that have been that have been published on this relationship. 300,000. And I think that we know what the result is. The result is that everybody in this room raises their hand to say, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, physical fitness, physical exercise is necessary for physical health, right? So now let's kind of do a contrast with regard to where we're at with our field, with our interests in mindfulness. And I'll ask a similar question. Does mental exercise improve psychological well-being? Again, raise your hands if you happen to think so. Okay, right, but you guys didn't end up here by accident, all right? So I'm kind of preaching to the choir. And I think that that's the case. I think that there are many of us now, and we're at kind of a tipping point where there's many of us that understand that just like the body, the brain, the mind can be trained to become more optimal in its own functioning. But I would say we're still at the infancy of understanding exactly what those evidence-based practices should be to optimize our well-being. We know generally the kinds of things that might work. And in fact, the National Institutes of Health have become quite interested in this because people are now deciding on their own how they're going to take matters into their own hands to engage in mind-body practices in order to improve their psychological health and well-being. And right now, the numbers are kind of interesting. It looks like about 8% of the population, this is even about a year or so old now, 8% of the US population engages in meditation or has at some point. All right, so it's taking shape, and we know that there's a popular interest in this. And we want to now look to see where is research relative to that interest. So this next slide is showing you what the rate of publications looks like for studies that have had the term mindfulness in their title. So this is 1980, and we go all the way up to 2015. And these are raw numbers, by the way, okay? So in 1980, we had no publications with that term. And in 2015, we had, 674 publications. Remember the number I gave you for physical fitness? 300,000. So there is absolutely, if you look at this graph, a proliferation of research, but it's still a very small number. All right? So as much as I'd love to be able to give you the definitive answer, the science is just not there yet, and we're going to start triangulating around what the science is starting to show us with regard to benefits that are observable and tractable. So, when I do go into many different kinds of organizations, and my lab's work is very much interested in understanding how we can bring sort of best practices of mindfulness training to high high-performance cohorts. So if you heard General Pyatt speak earlier, we've been working with the US military, we've worked with corporations, we've worked with athletes, and anytime I go into, and students, of course, at the University of Miami, anytime I go into an organization and speak to leaders and ask for their time so we can do our project, they ask me a pretty straightforward question that I have to answer to, and that question is, does it work? Like, you want me to spend my employees' time to do this? And usually I have to ask them for time during the workday because I don't want it to be voluntary. I want it to be as easy as possible for the people that I'm trying to involve to be engaged. And I think that that's a very fair question. Does it work? Unfortunately, I want to be able to answer that question better, which is the whole reason I'm doing the research. But even this simple question is actually complicated. So I want to unpack it a little bit for us to understand what we mean when we say, does it work? Let's start out by just asking what we mean by it. Right? We did a 1-minute mindfulness of breathing exercise, but there is a world within this word it with regard to mindfulness. And let me just give you a taste of what I mean. So we now are thankfully at a point in time where there are many options for you to have a chance to practice a mindfulness training, for example. You can do it on your own. You can buy a book that has guided CDs. You can engage in a clinical treatment. You can download an app. You can go to a website. You can get expert-guided practices in a group context. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example, is in over 750 medical centers around the world. So there are many different ways in which we have access to mindfulness practices. But this, unfortunately, also means that in trying to establish a research literature, it's complicated. And within all of those programs and practices, the actual exercises are also quite diverse. As we just did now, we could do a mindfulness of breathing exercise, which is intended to promote focused attention. And those are the instructions: focus on a specific sensation, for example. We could be doing open monitoring practices, which are quite different. Or other kinds of things, mantra recitation or loving kindness practice. So not only is the availability and the structure of how we engage in practices complex, but what we actually do in those programs is complex. So then there's the next question, another next word in this question, does it work? And that is asking about what it means for something to work. Right? So, and I think if we went around the room, I think a lot of us would have very different answers of what it means for this type of practice to be effective, important, beneficial, relevant. The way that I'm trying to break down our understanding in this conversation together is to think about working as essentially, does it reduce suffering? Does it actually alleviate people's suffering? And that suffering can take many different forms, right? We can have suffering in the body. We can have suffering in the mind. And we can have suffering in our relationships. And it looks like a lot of the research that's evidence-based that's growing kind of does divvy up the pie in that way. So there are now many studies that are specifically looking at physical ailments, usually stress-related ailments, that really indicate suffering in the body. So I'm just listing some of those here, from psoriasis to chronic pain to hypertension. Those are quite diverse in terms of the nature of the suffering, but they have in common something's not right in the body. Same thing with the mind, anxiety, depression, anxiety, PTSD. These are all ailments in the mind. And I would say a new area that is, I think, really a really rich area to delve into a little more is the impact of mindfulness training on relationships, whether that's a marital relationship, a parent-child relationship, or in the workplace setting. There's some recent studies that have looked at nurses and physicians and how well they get along when a mindfulness training program is implemented. So all of these that I've listed are words that describe published studies that find that, yes, indeed, for the metrics that they're interested in, engaging in a mindfulness training program does reduce suffering, right? So and if you remember back to Dan's talk or even Tim Ryan's talk, there are many of these. This is a long list that's growing. So I wanted to say a little bit more about how we'd go about trying to conclude that mindfulness training for this kind of an ailment, for example, would result in beneficial effects. And that takes a little bit of a deeper understanding of how we do research, how we do basic gold standard research to determine if something is effective. And that method is essentially the randomized controlled trial. All right, so if you're not familiar with it, essentially when you decide to do a study, you recruit participants, and you then divvy up your participants into the treatment group, for example, a mindfulness training program, and your other group, the control group, that isn't going to get mindfulness training. It's going to get something else. It's either going to get nothing at all and it's going to wait to get mindfulness, or it's going to get treatment as usual if it's in a clinical setting, or it's going to get some other kind of training that doesn't involve mindfulness. Then we apply the program itself. They engage in it for multiple weeks usually, and then we evaluate them again at the end of that program, and we see, do the two groups differ? This is an example of how we need to satisfy the basic requirements of research in order to make the claim that something was effective. If those two groups, after the trainings, significantly differ, we can say, oh, there's positive support that this worked. Everybody with me? So standard way of doing it. So now what's happened with the proliferation of studies, that we're at the point, even though we don't have anywhere near 300,000, but we're at the point now in this field where we can say, okay, let's look at training programs. Let's look at research studies that have used randomized trials and have manualized the program so we know exactly what they're doing. And let's look to see in a more meta and analytic way what these numbers of studies together are telling us. So not sort of onesie-twosies, but more than that, right? And that's what a recent paper in the premier journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, reported in 2014. And this was a paper that looked at 47 different studies, 3,500 or so participants, and what they concluded is that, yes, there is evidence, it's moderate. And this was specifically for reduction in negative symptoms associated with anxiety, depression, and there seems to be a significant reduction in pain that's reported. And what I thought was interesting is for depression, again, small effects, modest effects. It said the improvement was 10 to 20%. But I really liked what they said about what that 10 to 20% means clinically. And I want to just read what they said. They said that the effects are comparable with what would be expected from the use of an antidepressant in a primary care population without the associated toxicities. So engaging in a mindfulness training program would result in the same thing as a pharmacologic solution without sort of the downside of that. It's kind of interesting. Since then, there have been more studies that have been done, 115 randomized controlled trials, and again, a very similar list: anxiety, depression, reduction in stress, improvements in quality of life. And this is when we're comparing to treatment as usual, waitlist controls, or active comparisons. So it's like every other kind of other group other than the intervention group that you're looking at, you put them all together, again, you're finding beneficial effects. And probably this doesn't surprise you. So, back to that question is, does it work? I think at this point, just from based on what I've told you, the answer is yes. So it was nice talking to you all. See you guys. I wish it were that simple. I wish that two meta-analyses gave us the answer and that was it. But even recently as actually a month or two ago, we're starting to see some things look a little more complicated. And a set of studies that have just come out have actually accused this field of mindfulness research for having a positivity bias. What does that mean? I mean, of course, we're going to be a little up when we practice mindfulness, but what this is actually saying is not so great. What it's saying is that if you take all the randomized controlled trials that we know are being conducted, there are far fewer that are actually reporting results than we think should, which means that a lot of them that are not reporting results are probably not finding any effects at all, or not at least what was at all predicted. Okay? And I think that my field, as somebody who does this kind of research, this is something very important to take a look at. And it's a complicated issue. As somebody that, thankfully has tenure, but on the tenure track, you want to publish things that actually did something. And you also want to say that there's something useful that came out of all of your work. A null result doesn't go very far. But what this is suggesting to us is we are being irresponsible if all we publish is the good stuff. And we need to say fully what we're finding. And I actually think that's going to reveal better what is effective. Because if you do a study and you decide you're going to offer people 5 minutes of practice for 3 days, and you don't find any results, and then you don't publish it, we can never respond to the question, well, is 5 minutes of practice for 3 days enough? Essentially, you're losing out on information. So that's my call to action for the fellow scientists is like, let's air our dirty laundry. Let's get the stuff out of the file drawer and publish it. But what it does suggest, even with this in mind, is that we want to be a little bit more tempered in our enthusiasm to say yes. And at this point, I'd say it's a provisional yes, and we need to do a lot more work so that we're able to have an answer to this question of is it effective? With all this complexity in mind of what does it mean for it and what does it mean for work. All right, so this is kind of where my own research kind of gets on the scene. I'm not a clinical researcher. My interest was not in trying to figure out if a clinical treatment for mindfulness is effective. I'm a neuroscientist, and my interest from the start, as somebody who studies attention in my laboratory, my interest was really in seeing how a practice that guides people in a regular fashion to attend to their attention, how might it actually be altering the brain's attention system? What could it be doing if you're engaging this in a regular way? If you go back to the physical fitness analogy, if somebody goes to the gym every morning and works out with a particular circuit, let's say they're only going to do their upper body, you'd want to see, okay, is the upper body actually changing as a function of their exercise? So same idea. If it is attention that's key to the instructions, what happens to the brain's attention system? So my question really is not so much, is it effective, but how? How does mindfulness training work? And that's what I'd like to spend some time talking to you about, is a little bit of an understanding of what we're finding out. And again, as I mentioned, I'm a brain scientist, so one place that we'd want to look, of course, is the brain itself. So let's see what happens to the brain as a function of people engaging in mindfulness exercises. Are there changes? What's the nature of those changes? What's going on? So I really hate to do this, but I'm going to have to give you a little bit of a primer in brain science. And we'll try to make this as easy as possible, but I really, like I said, I think if you understand what we're dealing with where we're at with our science, you're going to be much more responsible consumers of information, and that's important to me. So one of the things that's quite important with regard to brain function that actually wasn't known when I started graduate school in the early 90s, the status quo was that essentially, the brain changes through development, and then you're kind of stuck with what you got. And it's just a downward spiral till we die. Quite depressing. And it was a very exciting time to study neuroscience in the 90s because that was when we started learning that actually we could grow new brain cells in the adult brain, neurogenesis. And we also started understanding that the brain could actually reorganize itself toward more healthy ways of functioning, not just reorganize as a function of recovery from stroke, for example. So that was a very empowering set of studies that came out that really made us rethink the capacity that we as humans have throughout our lifespans to make our own functioning more effective, more healthy, et cetera. All right, so this term has been used already, and it's going along the lines of what I said, neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. And why do I have a piece of crumpled paper there? Let me tell you. So let's think about what the brain actually is, okay? It's obviously a very important and special organ in the body. We can think about the brain as essentially a sheet of tissues stacked one on top of another, kind of like a stack of paper, crumpled together as hard as you possibly can to carry around in this protective container we call a skull. And through the course of evolution, it's become a very efficient way to have a complex organ in a small amount of space that doesn't weigh us all down, right? And so that crumpling itself is something called gyrification. And gyrification, the more gyrification, the healthier the brain. So as we age, or as a function of disease or stress, the brain starts uncrumpling. And that uncrumpling won't be the same in all areas of the brain, but targets of the brain that are vulnerable will start crumpling at a faster rate, okay? So that is important to know, is that we have a way now that we can look at the brain structure that'll indicate to us the health of the brain. All right, so that was one tool that we're gonna get into in a minute, neuroplasticity and gyrification. The second thing that happened in terms of a new tool that neuroscientists had was essentially something called functional connectivity, or intrinsic functional connectivity. And what we do when we're looking at intrinsic functional connectivity is we put people in the brain scanner and we have them do something. We could say just rest. And we look at blood flow in the brain to look at brain activity. And then what we do is we say, okay, we're gonna pick some region in the brain and we're gonna look at the activity in that region over some specified period of time, let's say 5 minutes of rest. And what you'll see is just that the activity kind of goes up and down and up and down and up and down. It fluctuates. And then we, using computer algorithms, say, give me an indication of all the other brain regions that follow that same temporal profile. So essentially, it's all the brain regions that are kind of revving together. That suggests to us that, oh, maybe they're working together. If they're moving up and down together, they might be talking to each other in some level. And that allows us to identify functional brain networks. We are now not at the point where we talk about different brain regions doing things. We're talking about brain networks that work together and have different nodes that do different things. Okay, but the cool thing about this was that you don't even have to have people doing anything in the scanner other than just hanging out and doing nothing at all. And through this kind of technology, what we've been able to do is learn a great deal. So, Tim, yesterday, if you were at his talk, he mentioned the executive system, right? And he mentioned the frontal lobes, and he was absolutely right, and I love having a congressman talk about brain science. But what he was talking about now, I'll tell you in our terms, is the central executive network, which, of course, is the frontal lobes, the front of the brain right up here. Whoops, I can't do it on here. Well, the front of the brain right up there. And the executive network is a brain system that is involved in selecting information and maintaining it. So you voluntarily decide to focus and you maintain your attention there, you get this system to be activated. There's another system called the Salience Network, very different neural pattern, you can see, that's involved essentially in noticing things. Things that come up in your environment, things that come up in your body that you notice. It becomes the most prevalent thing. And the final network that I'm going to share with you is the default mode network. That essentially we think is our internal mental chatter, sort of the monkey mind that Dan Harris was talking about. It's what we think of as the mind-wandering network. And not only are these three networks distinct and we think have different functions, but they're actually mutually inhibitory. So if your executive control network's on, you shouldn't be doing a lot of mind wandering, and vice versa. If you're doing a lot of mind wandering, your ability to focus and select is not going to be that great. Okay, so just by using these technologies, it's a very interesting way to think about how the brain is organized and our ways to probe into structure and function. All right, so now let's go on to mindfulness and the brain. And as I said, this is a burgeoning area of what we call contemplative neuroscience, where we're looking at a whole variety of different contemplative training regimens and seeing how brain function and structure may differ. So remember back to gyrification. One of the kind of growing areas that we're seeing is that there seems to be, and I like the title here, unique brain anatomy of meditation practitioners, alterations in cortical gyrification. So essentially what this study was saying is that the pattern of that crumpling of the brain is different for people that are meditation practitioners versus not, and that crumpling direction is more healthful looking. So it's a more tightly, densely packed way of the brain cells talking to each other. In case that wasn't obvious, that's kind of the benefit of the gyrification, is that now if you're more tightly packed together, all the different neurons can talk to each other more efficiently, right? So what we're seeing here is that, as you can see, that kind of splattering of different activity, it's not literally all over the brain, it's specific and clustered, which means that whatever it is that is trained is actually specific in terms of the functions that it's tapping into. So one study alone may not convince you. Now we're at the point where we've done, as a field, 21 different morphometric studies. So these are studies that highlight structural changes in the brain. It's the same as if you went to a hospital or a clinic and got an MRI for your ankle. We use the same parameters, but now we're going to put your head in instead of your foot and see what the structure looks like. And as you can see again, this is not just all over the brain. There are specific nodes that look like they're changing. But there's something else I have to say about these studies. So as with the last study in which it talked about the duration of meditation practice and the amount of gyrification, right? The result was essentially more practice, more gyrification in these particular nodes. Well, if you think about it, the design of that study is very different than the randomized controlled trial I was telling you about, because people are choosing on their own whether they're going to be practitioners, right? They say, I've been meditating for 10 years when you enroll them into the study. We didn't have them 10 years ago to assign them for 10 years of practice versus not. It's just people choosing to do it on their own. So this is what we call a cross-sectional study. This is when there's people that are already coming into you with very different experiences. We recruit for people that are long-term practitioners, and we say, you can't be in our study, you can be in our study only if you've had no prior experience, and we compare their brains. So that's an important thing to remember, is that these studies that have found very interesting brain changes, really the thing that I think got the popular media very excited about meditation, what they're doing is they're taking different kinds of people and comparing them. Now, you might say, look, it's the amount of time they're spending that's resulting in those brain changes, so it has to be the meditation. Well, it ends up that people that are long-term practitioners may also have different hobbies. They may have different diets. They may do other things that the non-meditators don't do. And there may have been pre-existing brain differences in them that made them decide to practice anyway. Right? So that's the kind of problem with this data with regard to broad interpretation. It's like, we don't really know because we didn't track them. So a better way to go is still to get people that are essentially naive to the practices, to train them and to track their brains before and after, if you're interested in looking at structure. And very few of those studies have been done. All right, so now let's move to function. So we got through gyrification. You guys are with me. I'm liking this. Nobody's sleeping yet. Okay, well, maybe some, but anyway. So now let's go back to function. So we talked about, remember I was telling you about intrinsic functional connectivity, having brain circuits that are organized in a very specific ways with regions talking to each other. So what we do for those kinds of studies is put people into the scanner and we say, okay, for the 5-minute period of time, just rest, do whatever you want. And then for the next 5 minutes, I want you to meditate. Now, we give them very specific instructions. For this 5 minutes, for this entire scan, actually, I want you to do a mindfulness of breathing exercise, or do a loving kindness exercise, or do a mantra recitation. Whatever it is, the instruction is specific. And then what you do is a comparison of the brain circuits that are activated during rest versus the meditation, and then you see if there are changes that are tractable. So we have many more studies like this, and this is a case where this is much more amenable to people that have no long-term experience but are naive and new to meditation to give it a try. There have been 78 of those studies done so far that are functional MRI studies. And all these different colored blobs I'm showing you are color-coded as a function of the kind of practice that the study focused on. So in red, for example, would be the focused attention practices that were done. So this would be something like mindfulness of breathing, similar to what we did at the start of our time together. And again, it's not just a random splattering of activity. It's organized in some way, but just looking at the brain alone is not telling us what exactly are the functions that are being altered. Right? Do you get that? That really it's saying, okay, that region is active. In a way, you can think about it like this. If you meet somebody and you realize that they have like amazing upper body strength, you see that their body is different. They must be doing something, but can you tell exactly what they did to result in that? They could have been doing many things, right? I mean, we don't know. They could be lifting heavy objects for a living. They could be going to the gym every day. There's so many different things that could result in the anatomy looking and behaving differently. And we're kind of in the same boat here. So what my lab has been doing, and what a lot of these studies are now moving toward, is to say, well, let's look with more precision at what the practice actually entailed to get a better handle on what brain systems, what functional brain networks might be changing. So let's think about, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's now look back at the practice that we actually did together, right? So we did a focused attention practice. I asked you to sit in a comfortable, alert posture and pay attention. Attention was the key aspect of the instruction. It was not, take a little nap. It was pay attention. And be specific, select a body sensation. Maintain it there for the time we're doing it. And if you happen to notice mind's not behaving, you're somewhere else, you notice your mind wandering, return it back. So I have those images up there to really give you a sense of what we mean by this. So by focus and select, we're really thinking about the brain's attention system, the orienting system, kind of like a flashlight. We direct it at will, it stays focused there, and whatever it is that occurs where that flashlight is pointing is more salient to us. If it's our breath, it's the sensations of breath that prominently take up our conscious experience. All right, then we can actually talk about maintaining information, we can, as working memory, and mind wandering. So now we can go back, if you remember, to these circuits and take a look to see which of these circuits are actually changing. Is it the selection and maintaining circuit? Is it the noticing? Is it the mind wandering? And as I said, we're just at the beginning stages, but if you even go back to that composite image I showed you, when we look at people that are doing a focused attention practice, we see that very specific nodes in that attention central executive network are changing. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is increasing in its activity, and the mind-wandering regions of posterior cingulate cortex is decreasing in activity. Now, the specific brain regions don't matter, but what I do want you to get is that this makes sense, right? So if you have people pay attention during their practice, the brain regions that support paying attention are looking like they're functioning more efficiently, and the brain regions that by default mind wander are being reduced in their activity profile. But again, this is not a direct measure of improvements in our ability to pay attention, because all I've done is looked at the brain. I've looked at the brain, I've seen the activity and said, oh, it matches what I know about the brain. If that region's active, they must be paying attention. But I've not done a direct correspondence between the improved ability to pay attention and those brain changes. So what I wanted to, and I think I only have like a minute left now, so what I wanted to convey to you now, and that's something called reverse inference, by the way, when you look at the brain and try to see function. And that's one of the things that I ask you to think about whenever you read any kind of paper that talks about brain imaging studies. If they're just showing you a blob on a brain and saying, oh, this means the self-enlightenment area is improved, we don't know what that even means. So it's very important that you just kind of take that with a grain of salt. It's like, we don't know what the functional circuitry of enlightenment is yet. So the ability to actually locate it and say it's improved is probably unlikely. But what my lab has been trying to do, and has been doing over the last 10 years or so, is using behavioral studies. So these are computer-based tasks that we know from the larger literature of cognitive neuroscience tap into precise cognitive functions: attention, working memory, alerting, anything that we know we can get a handle on whether people are improving. We bring people into the laboratory, we have them do these simple computer-based tasks, we look at performance, we have them go do a mindfulness training that we manualize and we know what they did, and then we have them come back. And we compare to see if performance actually differs before and after the training. If performance actually differs. At the same time, we take their self-reports of mood and stress, et cetera, to see how it may be corresponding to their subjective experience of how the mindfulness training program shifts. Now, you might say, why attention? Why is attention so important? It's important for every single thing we do, right? Every decision we make, learning, communicating, regulating our mood, it is a central hub. And if we can alter our attention, I think it provides us a gateway into powerfully being able to impact many aspects of our life and of our well-being. So, just to kind of tell you where we're at with regard to the studies, I'm just kind of laundry listing here that we now know that there are many, many studies, not many, there are several studies that have found that attention actually is improved in performance on attention tasks. That's like the flashlight I was describing. And performance on working memory tasks. Working memory is another very powerful brain system that has to do with maintaining and manipulating information over short intervals. Think of the last time you were having a conversation with somebody and they didn't even pause for you to say what you want to say. Ever happened to you? And you're kind of like, you're trying to hold in your mind your idea that you want to communicate. You just taxed your working memory right there, right? It's keeping the active representations of conscious experience in ready access form so that you can communicate. That's just one example. We use it all the time for a lot of different things. Its most critical use, I would say, is actually to engage in emotion regulation. And when people get the working memory depleted, their emotion regulation suffers. So it's an important system. So what I want to just kind of leave you with is that we are now getting a sense of the brain systems and the performance metrics that really are altered as a function of mindfulness training. And as was mentioned, in the earlier presentation by General Pyatt, a lot of our work now is moving in the direction of seeing not only if mindfulness training can help, which I think is the ultimate goal, but when you are dealing with people that are in high-stress occupations, and I would probably say many of you are in that position, and have periods of time during those high-stress occupations in which you are under intensive demands, what happens to your attention during those periods of time, right? Now, it could be a report that's due. It could be tax season if you're an accountant. It could be preparing for the big game if you're an athlete. Or it could be a soldier getting ready to deploy to a war zone. And what we're finding across the board is that attention suffers when we're under high stress. We are depleting our capacity to pay attention, and it corresponds to a high stress interval. And that's bad news, because what does that mean? The exact thing that's going to allow us to perform better when we're under stress is the thing we have less of. So our work is now trying to see what happens to attention if it declines under high stress. Can mindfulness training protect against that decline? And those are some of the most powerful and I think exciting aspects of our research, especially when it comes to groups like pre-deployment soldiers. If they decline in their functioning, if we do nothing at all, can we protect against this? And we're finding in our initial work so far that we can. And when we do that, when we protect their attention from declining, we actually do protect their mood from declining. So I want to just leave you with the idea that we started out, thinking about, does physical activity improve physical well-being? And everybody raised their hand when I asked the second question, does mental activity, mental exercise improve mental well-being? We all can have that understanding, but the call to action that I'd ask you to help me with, as people that want to bring this more into the workplace setting, is to not disregard research and to help us produce a more robust research enterprise so we can inform people on the best practices of how to bring mindfulness into the workplace, for example. And I want to just end by thanking all of you for your attention.